So we need you to participate and make this be a voice for the humane treatment of each other and for yourself. One bill that we are seeking and have promoted is medical aid in dying bill called End of Life Options. It's making its way through the House. It may get to the final committee in the House of Representatives in Minnesota. That is so awesome. What I'm not sure about is where it's at in the Senate. I don't know. But this is the first time it's ever gotten anywhere. And so if you want to see for yourself or someone else options, if you get to that need at the end of your life, don't we want to have that chance to treat each other humanely? And so please sign up for a newsletter that we send out maybe every couple weeks on bills you can advocate for to help this be the world you want to see. And so I will turn it over to, I think, Suzanne.
Hello everybody, thank you for coming. I'm here to talk about an upcoming event called the National Day of Reason. It's a day that we gather at the Capitol with legislators, secular groups from around the state, advocacy groups in areas like abortion rights, LGBTQ rights, medical aid in dying. Takes place on May 1st from 8:30 to 10. We've got a couple good speakers coming. Brad Millar of the Center for Free Thought Equality in Washington, D.C. That's the political arm of the American Humanist Association. And we have a local speaker, Dipinder Singh Mayal of the American Civil Liberties Union. And we'll have a bunch of members of the Secular Government Caucus speaking. So those are the facts. Now here's the pitch. How many of you were here when Brad Onishi spoke to our group? Okay, fair number. Do you remember what he said? He said the threat of Christian nationalism is really harming our democracy. Please do just one thing. If you can't do a lot of things, just pick one thing that you can do. So we're going to make it easy for you. Here's your one thing. Just show up at the Capitol on May 1. We've held Day of Reason events for a number of years, but this one is more urgent than ever before. As we say in our announcement about the meeting, Christian nationalism is taking its toll across the country. Limits to reproductive freedom, attacks on trans students, book bans, efforts to damage our public schools, political leaders who say they are following God's instructions. Let's show up in force to say not in Minnesota. Rest assured, the prayer advocates will be at the legislature. They always show up on the day of prayer and have a big crowd there. So this is our chance to show legislators that we are also a force to be reckoned with. If you want more information about the event, there's some flyers out on the front table, or you can just talk to me or any of the other board members. Hope to see you there.
Hello, my name is Mitch Thompson. I am the Vice President of Humanities Minnesota. And first of all, I'm here to talk about the Nominations Committee announcement for our board. But before I do that, I do want to say that it's an all-volunteer organization that we have here. And two people who put a tremendous amount of work in it are Audrey and Suzanne, who you heard from today. So they do tremendous amount of stuff. And I don't think we say it often enough how much they actually do and recognize it enough. So I wanted to start with that today. So as an organization, the election for our board of directors is coming up in May. The board has assembled a nominations committee. I'm supposed to know that you're supposed to talk on the mic because I don't remember so much. The board has assembled a nominations committee as specified by our bylaws, and they consist of myself, Christine, who also spoke earlier, and then Audrey as well. Board terms are for 2 years, and we have some current board members who plan to run again, and we do have an open seat, potentially 2. If you are interested in serving on the board or want to know more about what is involved, please contact one of us. You can also just contact the general humanist email. Or if you'd like to nominate a fellow member, please pass along that name to us. The committee will be vetting various candidates and put together our recommended slate to be announced at next month's community gathering in April. The election will be in May at our annual meeting, which will be here. So I don't know what happens next. I believe Valerie comes back up and introduces our speaker. So thank you.
And just for the record, Mitch does a ton of stuff too, as do a bunch of other people. We are a growing organization, and there are just so many people involved, and we need to build a deeper bench though. So if you have an interest, we're not asking you to take over anything, but come work alongside us. And so when we do announce our candidates for our May election for the board at next month's meeting, I do want to invite and encourage you all to come back next month on April 20th, when we will have our Earth Day program, and our speaker will be Professor Jason Lukasik, not sure I'm saying that right, of Augsburg University, and his talk is going to focus on something very appropriate for Earth Day. He's going to talk about our capitalist, colonial, and consumptive culture, and help us think through the cultural changes and shifts necessary to bring about broader, sustainable, ecological change. Really to help us rethink how we think of ourselves as part of the natural world. So I think that will be a very good talk, and I hope to see many of you back next month. But to today's speaker. About a dozen years ago, I was scouring local philosophy departments here in the Twin Cities to see who was doing interesting work that was applicable to living the contemporary humanist life stance. There's not a lot of philosophers out there who say, I'm a humanist, and we go to the academic community because that's where we want to find knowledge and what the latest is happening. But there's very few out there that stamp themselves and say, I'm a humanist, but they're doing good work, good humanist, secular work, and we want to know about it. But that is when I happened upon our speaker for today, Valerie Tiberius. And she doesn't know this, but I got a copy of her book, of her latest book. It's called The Reflective Life, Living Wisely Within Our Limits. And I read that book, and as many of you know, I do little sessions, intro to humanism sessions I've been doing for our organization for many years. And I have really incorporated a lot of what she said in that book, thinking it was very useful as we think about, as secular people, how do we live our values and how do we show up in the world in effective ways and not feel overwhelmed. I found it very helpful, and I sort of kept an eye on her. But oftentimes we're doing talks about policy issues, and those are the kind of speakers we have, or maybe some latest scientific discovery or information. And so I just sort of tucked it away in the back of my mind. But finally, I said, it's time to bring Professor Tiberius to Humanist MN. And I am delighted that she was willing and able to come and speak to us today. In the meantime, she's written more books and articles and been teaching at the University of Minnesota in the philosophy department, and really focused on this idea of well-being, which is so core to who we are as humanists. So please join me in welcoming Professor Tiberius here today to speak to us.
Can I switch to this mic? Oh, that works. Okay, good. Let's see. It's really great to be here, and thank you for such a lovely introduction. I have to say, I'm extremely impressed that you got something out of that book. My father told me it was dense. That it was my first book, so I was writing to impress a tenure committee, not to communicate things. I have a soft spot in my heart for humanists and the humanist society, because when I was about 7, maybe, I asked my dad, how come we didn't go to Sunday school? Because I knew all my friends went either to Sunday school or Hebrew school or whatever they did on the weekend. And I loved school. I thought that sounded pretty good. So after my father had explained to me the problem of evil and why we don't believe in God, he said, but if you want to go to Sunday school, sweetie, I'll find you one. So he found a Sunday school at a Unitarian church, Universalist Unitarian church. And the assignment for the Sunday school class that day was to bring a symbol from your religion, because universalism, right? And as far as I knew, we didn't have a religion, so I was like, Dad, I have to bring a symbol from our religion. And he gave me that pin, a lapel pin from the American Humanist Society, which he belonged to. And that's what I brought, the little 7-year-old. No clue what humanism was, but ever since then, I have felt very fondly about humanist societies. So this is a philosophy talk, and that means there aren't any discoveries or data or answers. There's kind of a lot of thinking about what the question is, and maybe some insights and observations, trying to figure out how to not stand at the podium but also not be walking behind the podium. Well, this works, I guess. So what I'm going to talk about is what philosophers who are interested in well-being do. What is this idea of well-being that, as philosophers think about it? What are the theories of well-being that we defend and debate about? And I'm going to tell you a little bit about my own preferred theory, and then hopefully talk a little bit about, if you take the suggestion that I'm making about the best way to think about well-being, what implications does that have for how we can help other people? This is my most recent book, which my dad did not think was dense. It was written for a more popular audience, and some of the ideas come from this book. You'll notice the appearance and reappearance of a turtle. In the book, I use this character called Millicent the Turtle to talk about goal-seeking creatures. And my mom, who has to get equal time to my dad because they're divorced and they count, she just loved Millicent the Turtle, which makes me wonder if she actually understood what the book was about. But she did really love Millicent, and she bought me a ceramic turtle to kind of commemorate the book. And so I had turtles on the brain when I was thinking in this book, and also thinking about constructing talks based on the book. So when the turtle appears, you'll know we're switching sections. So for any kind of philosophical theory of anything, you have to have starting points. And my starting points are secular starting points, very naturalistic starting points. The basic, I would also like my starting points to be as minimal as possible so that more people can believe what I'm saying and sign on to the approach. So I basically just start by thinking about human beings as goal-seeking creatures. We are organisms that pursue our goals, just like dogs or turtles or pigs. For any goal-seeking creatures, there are some goals that are built into the system. So any goal-seeking creature has to have some tendency, some motivation to explore the world. If it doesn't, it will sit where it is and never get anything. But we also, any goal-seeking system also has to have some motivation to be stable and to sit tight with what they have. And that's because if the only thing you have is a motivation to explore, you expose yourself to all sorts of risk and danger. So all goal-seeking organisms have those two basic goals, a motivation to explore and a motivation to stop. Human goal-seeking creatures also have just about all of us the goal of affiliation with other human beings. We are social creatures, and we want to feel good. That's part of our goal-seeking system. When we get the thing that we've been working towards, it makes us feel pleased or satisfied or happy. And so part of what we want in life is to get those feelings that are kind of the reward for successful goal-seeking behavior. So those are some basic goals that human beings have. Things get less basic as we develop. Ultimately, each of us develops multiple goals, and those goals form a kind of system that's often pretty complicated and arranged into a hierarchy. You want some things more than others. You want some things as a means to the other things that you want for themselves. So we have very large and messy goal hierarchies. You know, I want to complete this talk without falling down the stairs. I also want world peace. I want to preserve my marriage. I want to have dinner tonight. Tons and tons of goals, big and small. People don't all have the same goals. I think that almost all human beings, not every single human being, but almost all human beings have certain very basic goals in common, like the ones I went through on the previous slide. But there are lots of individual differences. So, you know, right now, none of you probably has the goal to maintain my marriage. That's my goal, not yours. You have your own. So there are individual differences in the goals we have. There's individual differences in how we prioritize our goals. Some people take career to be more important than friendship, and other people vice versa. So individual differences become important when we think about what it is for any single person to live well. We're also, this is one that philosophers struggle with because we tend to think we know everything. But in fact, we're not always consciously aware of all the goals that we have. It's at least true that sometimes there are motivations, desires, or emotions that are part of goals, goal states that we're just not aware of. Sometimes, if that doesn't make sense to you, you can think about the fact that there are people who, you know, go to a therapist to find out what they really want, and it takes some thinking and reflection to figure out what it is that you really want, because those motivations and emotional tendencies that are pulling you are not completely conscious. So that's going to be important for this picture too. So the summary about the starting point: human beings are profoundly social creatures with complex goal hierarchies that we don't fully understand. That's, if you don't remember anything else, that's the view of human nature that I'm starting with. Okay, so there's the turtle, so different section, the overview of the theories of well-being that they have in philosophy. It turned out that in the book, the example I had of Millicent, and her goal was that she had a goal to reach the strawberries on the other side of the road, and that she needed some exploration to get her to cross the road, but if she didn't have any tendency towards stability, she would end up getting hit by a car. And then I discovered that, in fact, although I just made it up, turtles love strawberries. So I was delighted that I inadvertently said something accurate. So first, I want to kind of tell you what philosophers mean by well-being. We do not mean mental health or physical health. We don't mean what's instrumentally good or good for you as a means to getting other things like money. We don't mean the HR definition of well-being as wellness, whatever that is. So we're not talking about that. What we are talking about when philosophers talk about well-being, they're talking about this really ancient philosophical question about a good life, about the thing that is basically or intrinsically good for you, which could be different from other kinds of good. It might not be an aesthetically good life. It might not even be a morally good life. But what is the life that's good for you? There's an open question about the relationship between a good life for you personally and a morally good life. I tend to think they go together because most of us want to be moral people, but that's an open question in philosophy. So that's what we're talking about, what's the life that's basically good for a person. And philosophers have 3 different types of theories about this. I'm guessing hedonism might be one that people have heard of. The basic idea of hedonism is that the good life for you is a life in which you get more pleasure and less pain. The more pleasure you have and the less pain you have, the better your life is, according to this theory. That's the theory of the utilitarian philosophers, starting with Jeremy Bentham and John Stuart Mill. It's a popular theory these days. It might sound very implausible, but in philosophy it has had a lot of adherents. And it makes some sense when you think that what it's saying is, ultimately, it's the pleasure that's good for you. So of course, friendship is good for you and doing nice things for other people, all that is good for you. But if you ask why, it bottoms out in pleasure. So hedonism also, it's an old theory, it's a popular theory, and because of that, it has attracted a lot of criticisms. I could just sum up these criticisms by saying pleasure is not our only goal. Some people want things like relationships with other people, knowledge, that's a picture of a library, or achievement, that's a picture of someone who just ran a marathon. Some people want those things not because they bring pleasure, but because they take them to be important for other reasons. So hedonism's been criticized a lot for making a mistake of reducing everything that we care about to pleasure, and thereby missing a lot of what's actually valuable about things like achievement and relationships and knowledge. So here's a second kind of theory that philosophers propose, which seems to kind of do better than hedonism because it says, okay, maybe that was a mistake to reduce everything to pleasure. There's actually a list of goods. And these theories take this list to be a list of objective goods, of things that are good for a person, independently of that person's psychology. These things are just good, period. And they're good for you when you get them. So on this view, friendship, achievement, typically virtue, knowledge, these things are all good. And what well-being is you being fortunate enough to get those things. Then you have well-being. This theory has problems too. It's a pattern in philosophy. There's proposals and then devastating criticisms. So what about people who don't enjoy those objective goods? There might be people who think, I don't really care about knowledge. I mean, it doesn't do anything for me. There might be people who are cognitively different, impaired, and are not capable of experiencing knowledge or getting a whole lot of knowledge. There might be people who don't prioritize achievement. So these theories have been criticized because they say that these things are good for people no matter what those people say. They're just objectively good. And that's taken to be a problem. Also, these objective list theories, they don't have a very good answer for how to compare the different goods with each other. So it's, easy to say that a good life, if you want well-being, you should get friendship and learn some things and have some achievements. But what happens when those different goods are in competition with each other? The theory just has nothing to say about it. So the third type of theory is, in the philosophy world, it's called desire satisfaction theory, and it says, essentially, well-being is getting what you want. That's a very simple version of it, but it's basically what the theory says. So for this theory, pleasure is important and it is valuable, but not just because it's pleasure. It's important and valuable and good for you because you want it. All of those other goods, virtue, friendship, knowledge, they're good too for people who want them. It's the wanting things that make them good for you. That's the desire satisfaction theory. So desire satisfaction theory has some advantages. And the theory that I prefer is similar to it. One advantage it has, I think it's the Goldilocks advantage of the theory. It says that how we feel is important, but it's not the only thing that's important. So hedonism thinks pleasure, the feeling of pleasure, that's it. Well, that doesn't seem right. And objective list says that feeling of pleasure, feeling of enjoyment in taking enjoyment in the goods, that's not relevant to their goodness at all. Whereas desire satisfaction theory says, yeah, feelings are important because we care about how we feel. We want to feel good, but it doesn't make those feelings the be-all and end-all. It doesn't reduce everything to those feelings. It's a helpful theory when it comes to the fact that we have complex sets of goals. For hedonism, pleasure is the only goal, ultimate goal. Doesn't recognize the complexity of our goals at all. For those objective list theories, they kind of assume we all have the same goals. Or either that or they assume what our goals are doesn't really matter. Desire satisfaction theory is nice because it makes what's good for a person depend on that person's goals. And if that person has very complex system of goals and of desires, then what's good for them is going to be multifarious. It's going to be kind of complicated. And that seems like the right thing. Unfortunately, desire satisfaction theory has also been attacked. One of the main problems that has been raised for it is the so-called problem of defective desires. You've probably already, it's possible that as soon as I said that there's this well-known philosophical theory that says well-being is just getting what you want, you may have already been thinking of some of these counterexamples. There are people who don't want to get life-saving vaccines. Sort of seems like those vaccines are still good for them and that there's something wrong with their desires. There are people who want to lie on top of dangerous animals in cages or stick their heads inside the mouths of crocodiles. kind of seems to me like these are not good things to do for people, but there are people who want to do that. There are at least cartoon characters who want really nothing but to lie around and waste their talents on the couch with eating a lot of donuts. That doesn't seem like it's good for people or even for Homer. So it really seems like we can have bad desires. We can have defective desires or bad goals, and that makes this theory seem like something must be wrong with it. So, what I've been doing, along with some other philosophers who I think are on my team, is developing a theory that's kind of like that desire satisfaction theory, but instead of talking about what people desire, it talks about what people value. And values, as I'll say, are different. They include desires, but they're more robust, complex psychological states. So the theory basically just says that well-being is essentially fulfilling or achieving or living up to what you value over the course of your life. So it's not just getting anything you happen to want, but it is getting in your life the things that you value. Those are probably things like friendship, family relationships, success in your work, helping other people, being part of a community, whatever it is that you would say you valued. If we had time to chat about it, if you live up to those values over the rest of your life, you have lived a good life. You've lived well. So this type of theory obviously raises some questions. The first question is, what is a value? It's pretty easy to think about what a desire is. We're all pretty sure on that. But values, the word values gets used in different ways by different people. We have, family values and Christian values and corporate values and green values, and the word values is cheap. So I mean something very particular. There's a kind of technical definition at the top, which I'll let you read while I get a drink. But it's easier to explain with an example. So I'm guessing most people here, because you're at a talk on a lovely Saturday afternoon, you probably value education. And what does that mean on my theory, according to my theory? What does that mean that you value education as opposed to just wanting it or thinking it's nice? Well, I think it means that those of us who value education, we have certain kinds of feelings about it. We tend to feel joy when we learn new things, or when we watch our children or nieces and nephews learn new things at school or learn how to read. We tend to take education to be relevant in our reasoning about how to live our lives. So if you value education, you're going to be inclined to think that you have to plan for it, set aside an afternoon to come to a talk, or enroll in a class at a university, or buy a book. But that's a way that education figures into your own thinking about what to do in your life, what you have reason to do. And then, of course, valuing education includes a bunch of desires. You want to learn stuff. You want to read. You want to explore new things. So to value something is to have this kind of complex set of psychological attitudes towards it. It's not just wanting it. Valuing involves more than that. Also, typically with our values, as opposed to mere wants, values are usually pretty stable and mutually reinforcing. So if you value education, it's likely that that didn't just pop into your head 5 seconds ago, and that it's probably going to stick around for another decade or so. It's also likely to be something that fits well with the other things that you care about. So maybe you pursue the value of education together with your friends or with family members. Maybe it helps you in your career, but it's something that's kind of integrated into your life more than a mere desire. So that's what values are. What's fulfillment? Fulfillment's pretty complicated because it depends on the value. To fulfill the value of education, it kind of depends on how you value it. For some people, that will mean going to college, doing continuing education, but for other people, it will mean reading a lot of books and talking to people. So education, what it means to fulfill that value depends on what standards you have for it, and individual people might have different standards for the same value. So if you think about people who value sports, and I believe this is hockey. I grew up in Canada, and yet I never really got into hockey. I should probably correct that at some point. The thing is that you probably know this in your own friend set. People value sports in many different ways. For some people, valuing sports means constantly getting better and improving your game, decreasing your time for a run if you're a runner, becoming more competitive if you're like a team player, like a hockey player. For other people, it just means showing up, just getting on the ice. They don't care about winning. For some people, it really has to do with teamwork, and what they want is to support their team, to be, so if they get injured, maybe they become a coach, and that's just as good for them. But people differ in how they think about what it means to fulfill their values. The important thing is that we all have some notion of what our values are, what they mean to us, and fulfilling your values just means living up to those standards, whatever they are for you. So I think this way of thinking about well-being has some advantages. For this crowd, it's not something I usually mention in a philosophy context, but it's certainly a way of thinking about well-being that's entirely secular and naturalistic. It just treats human beings as any other kind of animal and asks, what is it for that kind of animal to do well? It has some other advantages. I think it retains the good things about desire theories. It makes pleasure important because people value feeling good, but it doesn't make pleasure the only good. It also makes sense of the fact that people differ. We don't all have exactly the same values. We don't all understand our values in the same way. And this value fulfillment theory allows for that. I think it also has an advantage over desire satisfaction theories. And that is that values, because they're more complex than desires, they can be, essentially, we can criticize them against an ideal. And I'm going to show you what I mean by this. But the values you happen to have, they could be defective in one way or another, and we can make sense of talking about having better values. So that's what I'm going to talk about next. So first, here's one way that values might not be ideal. One way in which the values that you have might not be the best ones for you. They might not be very psychologically integrated. So take, for example, someone, I was I teach at a liberal arts college, so this is based on many students that I have talked to who come in and think, I want to be a doctor, I've always wanted to be a doctor, my parents want me to be a doctor, I want to do something that helps people, but I hate blood, I'm falling asleep in my biology classes, I cannot stand science. So this is somebody who has a kind of interior conflict about their values. Their thoughts are pulling in one direction, their emotions are pulling in a different direction. This is a kind of typical experience for college students, and that's probably for the best. It's probably a good thing. But I think we all experience this type of thing at one point or another when we have some inner conflict about something. So inner conflict is one way that our values can be not ideal. We can also have values that conflict with each other. Just to take a kind of silly example, if you want to be a rock climber and you also want to be a hand model, that's not going to work out for you. If you want to be an astronaut who goes to Mars and a stay-at-home parent, not happening. There's some goals that you just cannot put together in a single life. So that's another way that our values are not always ideal. They can conflict with each other. Last thing, I mentioned that what it means to fulfill a value depends on the standards that you have for it. Our standards also might not be ideal. So sometimes people interpret career success, for instance, in a way that creates lots of other conflicts with other goals and values that they have. Sometimes people interpret parenthood in a way that creates lots of conflict with the rest of the things that they care about in their lives. So it's not that you need to get rid of the goal of having a career or being a parent, but it might be best to reinterpret those goals so that your standards for success are not so challenging given the other things that are on your plate. So there's this kind of standard of more ideal values that we can use to understand why the values that you just happen to have at the moment, they might not be the best ones for you. So it allows us to make sense of this idea that, well, yeah, sometimes values can be defective, and it can make sense for somebody to change the things that they care about, or to change how they prioritize them, or to change how they interpret what it means to fulfill them. When we have values that are closer to that ideal, not conflicted internally, not conflicting with each other, we do better because it's like we don't have an anchor on the boat towards fulfillment. So all that conflict frustrates fulfillment. So wrapping up that section, I think the best life for a person in the best way to understand it is that it's a life rich in value fulfillment. And I also think that we could say a life rich in more ideal value fulfillment, because you get more fulfillment when your values are closer to that ideal. Okay, the turtle is back. So we're switching to the last section. How does this help us help people? I'm not a political scientist or even a very political person, so when I'm thinking about helping people, I have, in my research, I have tended to think about the context of helping friends, helping the people we know, friends and family. I have done some work about public policy and why this value fulfillment approach is a good approach for public policy. And feel free to ask me about that when we're eating cookies or drinking juice or whatever, but just in the rest of the talk, I'm going to focus on the more personal case. I actually think they're connected. It's not like there's a completely different message for helping strangers than there is for helping people you know, but I've been most interested in the case of helping people you know. So the obvious point is, if well-being is value fulfillment, can't help people unless you know what they value. That's the no-brainer. Well, how do we know what other people value? One thing we can do is go back to human nature, because we all evolved. We are all the product of evolution, so we're very likely to have some of the same basic values. Even though we don't interpret them all the same way, we don't prioritize them all the same way, almost all human beings are going to have values, this list of values. We talked about some of these before when I was talking about goal-seeking organisms and Millicent the turtle. You have to have some exploration, you have to have some motivation to explore, you have to have some motivation to be stable and to sit tight. Human beings are very strongly motivated to be in affiliation with other people. We're very likely to include relationships in our values. But I added a few others here from the literature on values and the psychological literature on human needs. Almost everybody values having some competence, being able to do things in a satisfying way, developing skills. Almost everybody values having some autonomy. We did talk about pleasure, and so I'm not going to go over that again, but almost everybody values having some autonomy, some control over what happens to them. Tends to be very important for people. And I switched in the word happiness instead of pleasure, so that this makes a nice acronym. CHASER. It's not bad. It seems like everybody in the well-being literature has an acronym. So I thought if I'm going to go anywhere in life, it couldn't be, otherwise it would be, oh, I could have been CAPER. No, I don't know. It's CHASER. CHASER is good because you chase your goals. I like it. Okay, so human nature is a good starting point. One way to think about, and this is a starting point that works in the public policy context where we don't know the individuals. We just know that we're trying to help people. So we can get some information just by thinking about human nature and what people are like. But then there's also the question of individual differences that was also in the start of the talk, the importance of coming up with a theory of well-being that respects our individual differences. We're all human, so I think almost all of us have some very similar basic goals, but we have different specifics. So some people value one or two best friendships. Some people value being in a larger community of friends. Some people value family, and what they mean is their chosen family. Other people value family, and what they mean is their biological extended family with 10 million cousins and whatnot. People value things in different ways. So even if we all value relationships, the specifics are different from person to person. We also have very different experiences, of course. The experience of the tiny dog being thrown in the mud is going to be quite different from the tall dog. I'm a big fan of dogs, actually. Maybe I should just replace all the turtles with dogs. They're very photogenic. Those experiences can affect what paths are open to people to fulfill their values. So if you're trying to help other people, knowing what they've experienced in their life is important. There are differences in how we prioritize our values. So this example is from Lindsay Addario, who is a war photographer. And this is a quote from her when she was on assignment, I think in Afghanistan. And she says, she's with two of her colleagues, two other journalists. There was nothing to do but sleep and talk, mostly about the pain we were causing our spouses who were at home with their children. Yet, as guilty as we felt and as terrified as we were, each of us knew that this work was an intrinsic part of who we were. It's what we believed in. It governed our lives. Lindsay Addario and I both value our work and our families. But she prioritizes work in a way that I never could. I'm not capable. Might have a lot to do with her courage and my lack of it, but it's still remarkable to me the sacrifices that she's made for the things that she thinks are most important in life. It's pretty clear when you read her writing that it's not that she doesn't value her family, but she has very clear priorities that are quite different from mine. There's also differences in how we interpret our values. So people have different definitions of success. I have a lot of artists in my family, and sometimes it's hard to understand how the life of the artist is so important to them that they're willing to sacrifice other things for it, and that success to an artist doesn't necessarily mean being financially secure. One of my artist friends is much more concerned about having a life in which they're free to create than having a life in which they have a 401k. That's different from me, but very important to them. So, summing up, if we want to help other people we know, and I think a lot of this also applies to helping people we don't know, to helping strangers, we need to know what a valueful life would be for them, and that means knowing what their values are and how they might be more ideal. When it comes to helping people we don't know, it's often the case that we're motivated to help by pretty severe need and deprivation. And in those kinds of cases, you don't need to know a lot about a person's values to know that they need quality food and shelter. So when it comes to helping people who are deeply impoverished and disadvantaged, the nuances of philosophical theories, I don't really think they're that helpful. Because on any philosophical view, we shouldn't have people in our wealthy communities who don't have enough to eat. Any philosopher would agree with that, whether they were a hedonist or an objective list theorist or me. But when it comes to helping people we do know, who people we're in relationship with, where the question is not trying to meet their basic needs, but helping them do other things, in those sorts of cases, I think my theory suggests a sort of plea for humility. The plea for humility is premised on a fact about human psychology, which is that we tend to be pretty biased towards ourselves. We tend to think we're right. We tend to think we're better than everybody else. Objectively, according to some studies, we all tend to think we're better drivers than average. That can't be true. So I think because we have that tendency, and because there are so many individual differences, we ought to try to cultivate some humility. we don't have to be perfect about that. I think when you help other people, there's a process, and you can't just bootstrap your way into being humble and not thinking that you know everything. But you can think about it as a kind of process of helpfulness, where you have some initial response to the request for help or the need for help. You get a response from the other person, you reflect on it, you recalibrate a bit, you ask yourself, do I actually know everything in this situation? And you have more conversation with that person. So that's the sort of recommendation that I think comes out of the theory, given the nature of our psychological differences with respect to what we value. So, just wrapping up, I think that thinking about well-being in terms of value fulfillment has some real advantages over other approaches. I also think it's useful. I think it helps us to think about how to help other people. Here I was mostly talking about other people who we're close to, but I think, excuse me, I think it also can help us in thinking about how to help people in other places, other countries, other parts of the world. To help people, we have to know what they value, what they care about, and how. And I think we should, to do our best, try to avoid thinking that we know best all the time. Sometimes we do. I'm an oldest sister. That might be that the stuff about humility is just, research is me-search. That's what they say. And I will stop there. Thank you.
Thank you so much. We're going to have our usual Q&A. And so if you have a question for Professor Tiberius, you can come and just stand over here. And I'm just going to remind people to keep it to a question as opposed to a long commentary. It sounds like Professor Tiberius will stay for at least a little while to socialize, and maybe you can offer your commentary there. So try to keep it to a question, and let's make time for multiple questions, so keep it as short as possible.
Hello, just a quick question. Have you ever explored like the conflict between the values of society and the values of individuals? Because as we all know, like values is not just simply like what we hold, but our values are passed on of what our society have, and oftentimes we find ourselves very. The values are not very clear, or they're not easily changeable sometimes.
That's such a great question. So one way that one context in which I've thought about that is that when you're thinking when you're thinking about your own life and what you want to do is improve your own life, it's frequently the case that the reason the values you have are not ideal, the reason you're full of internal conflict or full of conflict among your values, is that you have grown up in a society that gives you a set of values that don't fit you. So I've thought about a lot of cases like that. It's not an easy process to try to train yourself out of the values that you grew up with that might be a bad fit in your own psychology, but I think it's something that it's important to do if you want to live a good life. So yeah, I think that's really important.
Hi, I'm going to cheat. I'm going to have two questions. One relating to each part of the title of the presentation. Sorry. First about well-being. The word happiness didn't come up much in your presentation. When it did come up, you treated it as almost synonymous with pleasure. As I'm sure you know, in philosophy, history philosophy, there's been a series of Aristotle, it's not just pleasure. So I'm wondering, well, first question, what's the relationship on your account between happiness and well-being? Second question goes to the other side, values, and that gets to the issue of relativism. Are values just up in the air, whatever we want them to be? You seem to kind of address this by setting a standard of integration where our values kind of work together, they match up, they don't conflict internally. And you also seem to kind of look for some grounding in human nature. So I'm wondering, those of us who are here, by and large, don't have a holy book where we can get our values that provides objective standards. Where can you get, is there an objective basis for values, or how do you avoid the problem of relativism?
Fantastic. So first, on the terminology, I should have thought more about that, because so what's going on in philosophy is, yes, the word happiness used to be the word that everybody used to talk about what we now call well-being. And in fact, happiness is the word that has been used historically to translate this concept that Aristotle talks about, which is eudaimonia, which really means, I mean, literally it means something like good spirit, but it's I think more accurately translated as flourishing. So these days, partly because of all the stuff that's going on in psychology departments, philosophers, almost all of us, have decided we are giving up on the word happiness. Let the hedonists have it, let the psychologists have it. If they want to think that happiness is just about feelings, that's fine. We will just use the word well-being to talk about what we've been trying to talk about for 2,000 years. So it's a little bit, because that's my background, that's where I was coming from. But it's not very, it's not the best solution, because the word happiness to normal people, which is what philosophers call non-philosophers, but normal people think happiness is something really important. It isn't just pleasure. So that's a very helpful comment, because when next time I give a talk that's not an academic talk, I should think more about that. So anyway, yeah. Second question about relativism, also such a great question. So I think that when it comes to well-being, when it comes to the kind of value that is particular to an individual organism, so it's what's good for you, I do think that that is ultimately subjective, and there are no objective standards. There is human nature, and I appeal to it. There's being reflective about your values and making sure they're consistent and they don't conflict with each other and you're not internally conflicted about them. But at the end of the day, that all boils down to the organism, because, you know, human nature, in my theory, it's not an external force. It's just you are the product of evolution, so you're going to tend to have a lot of stuff in common with other members of your species. So when it comes to well-being, I don't think there are objective standards. I try to hold relativism off as much as possible by saying, yeah, we're all a lot alike. And, you know, and you can't just go with whatever you happen to feel, because you have to make sure things are not conflicted in your head. So I'm trying to keep relativism at bay, but there's only so much you can do if you think that it's ultimately subjective. But when it comes to what's morally valuable or what's morally required, I'm not a relativist. So I think I haven't defended a moral theory, but when I think about, when I'm forced to, I think moral requirements are the result of a kind of ideal process of reflection among rational people. And that actually narrows things down a lot and really reduces the fear, the specter of relativism. Yeah, does that help?
A lot of great points, thank you. Carrying on this point, the conflict of values or the fulfillment of values, right? You speak about that, that basically describes me. So, help me out. What are the characteristics or dimensions or tools for prioritizing values that conflict? I want to be a stay-at-home dad who goes to Mars. Help me out.
That's hard. Stay home, because we're not there yet technologically, so there's that. I have a lot of, in the most recent book, I have a lot of strategies for how to think about what your values are. And I think some of those strategies are helpful for thinking through how to manage conflicts, because part of the issue when you're conflicted is a kind of indecision about which is really more important. And it can also be sometimes with value conflicts that the issue is you think about, parenting in this way that makes it incompatible with doing other stuff, but there are other ways to think about parenting. One needs to be open to them. So as far as, I'm not a therapist or a clinical psychologist, so I'm pretty weak on practical advice, sorry to say. But I do think some of the things that one can do, strategies that, this is going to sound funny coming from a philosopher, but strategies that allow you to disengage your rational linguistic brain and tune into your emotional responses are really important here. This is something I've learned from collaborating with psychologists, that some of these parts of our psychology that get mixed up and create conflict are not accessible immediately to our conscious attention. And so what we need to do is try to push away the conscious rationalizing and find out what's bubbling under the surface. And there are ways of doing that like using imaginative exercises, like imagination, exercising your imagination essentially. There are, books and there are therapists who use this kind of technique, and there are books on how to do it. Some of the things that, some of the practical suggestions in this line are things like just free form writing about your ideal future. You sort of, you try to do something that's calming, like do some deep breathing or something, and then you say, okay, I'm just gonna imagine myself in 10 years. What does that look like? And the goal there is that you're not supposed to think it through. You're not supposed to think, where am I now and how am I gonna get there, and you're just supposed to kind of, it's like having a dream. And that sort of imaginative exercise has been shown to uncover feelings for people that were previously not consciously, not part of conscious awareness. And there's some evidence that those sorts of exercises, these imagination exercises, actually help people fulfill their goals, because it lets them know about either the obstacles that are under the surface pulling them in the wrong direction. So there are things like that. That's probably the best I can do. But, we could talk over juice too.
Or a glass of wine.
Wait, is there wine out there? I should stop talking. Can I just say one more thing about the conflict? I feel like I shouldn't have answered that question like this amazing expert. I've had tons of conflict, and it's one of the things in my most recent book. There's a lot of personal reflection about the conflicts I've had being a woman philosopher, and it has caused me tremendous grief. So I can relate. I did want to say that.
So thanks for coming. And so I generally have a question as a layman, so apologies if I'm just off base here, but as I think about hedonism, I think, pleasure and pain is the emotional or physical feeling of good or feeling of bad. And I can understand the physical mechanisms by which that work, whether it arises out of whatever we call consciousness or out of our central nervous system. So is the value fulfillment system operating on those same mechanisms? And if it isn't, can you explain some of the mechanisms by which it is operating?
I'm kind of wondering if we mean the same thing by layman, because that didn't really sound like a layman question. It's a very interesting question, and I do think, so the work, I've been doing this work, not in books, but in academic papers with a personality psychologist at Minnesota who works on control theory. And so basically, his work is about the psychology of goal-seeking behavior. How does it actually happen? What are the psychological mechanisms that allow us to pursue our goals and get the things that we want? So one of the things I've been interested in doing is showing that this philosophical value fulfillment theory maps onto a real empirical psychological theory about how we pursue goals. So I do think that it's the same goal-seeking mechanisms that are the mechanisms for value fulfillment. It's just, it gets very complicated because when you talk about, often the examples used when psychologists talk about goal fulfillment theories are things like Millicent, the turtle, wants the strawberry. She has to walk this path to get it, and when she reaches the strawberry, if she hasn't been killed on the way, she eats it, there's a dopamine rush, she feels the pleasure of the experience, and that goes back into the learning mechanism that teaches Millicent that, oh, that was a good strategy. Next time I have that goal, next time next time I think to myself, strawberries, I should try that same thing. Or if she fails, if she gets to the strawberry and she tastes it and she thinks, blech, this is, spit it out, that is, she has been essentially, she's been punished for an unsuccessful strategy because it didn't get her the tasty thing she wanted. So that's how in the psychology of goal seeking, they use these very, very simple kinds of goals where pleasure is a reward in the learning system, learning how to act in a way that gets you what you want. And I do think that value fulfillment works in the same way. It's just a lot more, there's so many more variables.
So I was thinking about the discussion between happiness and pleasure, and I think there's if I can use this term, third path. I like the word contentment, because I think contentment allows for there to be space and opportunity for us to experience our unhappiness and displeasure as we're moving towards flourishing, whether it's for ourselves or our larger community. So I'm just curious, what would philosophers, how would they parse that out? What would they think of that idea?
Yeah, well, I love it. I'm big into contentment. I wish I had more of it. So I actually think that contentment is something that most of us value. So for me, the way it fits into my theory is that I think contentment is a value, and it can be one that you fulfill or not. If you're an anxious mess, you're not fulfilling it very well. There's a philosopher, Dan Habron, who actually works on happiness, where what he means is a psychological state, it's not flourishing or well-being, it's a psychological experience But he thinks it's much more complicated than pleasure, and he includes contentment in his theory of happiness. It's quite a nice theory, actually. He has a little book called A Very Short Introduction to Happiness. It's quite a fun read, actually. I'd recommend it, because he has this 3-part definition of happiness, and contentment is one of the components that he talks about. Yeah.
Actually, if I can get my question out here, maybe conflating too many ideas. Your definition to talk about values is a little more relativistic than I think some of us are comfortable with, because a lot of what we value is a kind of moral, as humanists, as a moral living, and how we're helping to create the world that we think needs to be on a whole bunch of levels. So if I have a value of living a moral life, and then I see people who have values that are very contrary to that, that feels very judgmental. But I mean, how can I be otherwise when you feel like there's people out there in the world that are hurting other people and destroying the planet and stuff like that? So, I don't know. For me, that value fulfillment is working towards these, what I call, very moral values. How should we think, I mean, is that okay? I mean, and to me that's, yes, you still can have morality and it still can be somewhat relative, but as humanists, I love what you said about it being a collaborative thing, because it really is. But can we feel good about having these moral values that we want to fulfill personally in our lives here in our humanist community, but collectively as well? I mean, are we being too judgmental?
Oh, absolutely not. You are exactly the right amount of judgmental. So the emphasis on humility and not being judgmental, it actually came from thinking about cases of families who reject their children because they come out as LGBTQ. So those were the examples that I was thinking about when I was first thinking about humility. I was reading articles about gay men born into evangelical churches and the Mormon church, and how they coped with the rejection, and what that, like for them, serious value conflict between their community, their church, sometimes their family, and their selves, like the way they valued being in relationship with other people, especially their romantic relationships. So I was thinking about those kinds of cases when that was sort of the impetus to thinking about how it's not, there's a lot of other people thinking they know what's best for others. That is also a problem. So I hope that helps to contextualize the point about, don't be too judgmental. I think that morally speaking, I mean, I would imagine when it comes to moral values that I share the moral values that you have. I'm guessing, given what I heard from the remarks at the beginning from the different officers of the society. And I think those moral values are absolutely vitally important, and that they generate obligations for all of us. And I don't think that those moral values are relative. But I do think that what it is for one organism to thrive is different from what it is for a group to morally thrive. So I think there is some sense in paying attention to the individual, because groups are made up of individuals. But when you get to the community and you ask questions about politics and how we should organize ourselves and how we should help other groups of people, at that point, you know, you have to champion some of the values that you have because of the conflict that there is between us and the rest of the world. So I absolutely don't think that, you know, well, some people think climate change is fine, or they don't think it exists, and some people think we should let the poor starve on the street and that we don't eat. I'm not for that. I am for thinking that what's good for individual people does depend on what those individual people are like, but one of my goals is to help make the world a better place. And that's one of your goals too, and a goal of this whole society. And if that's your goal, you have to make some assumptions about which values are worth standing up for and worth fighting for. And some of those values are moral values that, as I say, I don't think are relative. I think they're well, I guess I would say I think they're kind of rational values, which fits with the Day of Reason.
Yeah.
I love that, yeah.
Exactly. Well, thank you for that reassurance. Thank you so much for coming today. And yes, and thanks to everyone here for coming. And just out there in the lobby, the gallery, whatever they call it, are refreshments, some nibbles, and there's wine and beer and soft drinks and probably sparkling water. So stick around and enjoy each other's company, and I think Professor Tiberius might stop in too.
I found out there's wine.
Yes. Someone get this woman a glass of wine. Yes, all right. So thank you for coming in. Hope to see you all soon.